Tonight, we won't unroll papyrus to recite lists of kings or memorize the mathematics of harvests. Instead, we'll drift into a harbor where gulls circle over ships heavy with scrolls, and where a city once dreamed it could gather all human thought under a single roof. Here, the air carries both the salt of the sea and the dust of parchment, and each wave that breaks against the quay seems to whisper a fragment of lost wisdom. So lower the lights. Let the hush of the library press gently against your chest. And if your breathing begins to follow the rhythm of waves lapping against stone, that's just Alexandria drawing you inward. And if you re-still with me when we arrive at the part about librarians measuring scrolls with string to charge fairly for copying, feel free to subscribe or simply drift further into the silence of Alexandria where the muses do not track metrics. The story usually begins with a royal daydream, a Macedonian pharaoh staring across a bright harbor and deciding that wisdom should live within walking distance of lunch. Ptolemy, or perhaps his son, liked the sound of that. A library would be built near the palace gardens, under colonnades full of shade and cheerful echoes, beside a curious institution called the Mausoleum, the place of the muses, which was part research park, part monastery for scholars, part very serious picnic. There would be rooms for reading and rooms for copying, rooms for statues that listened well, and a long refectory where philosophers practiced not spilling soup while discussing astronomy. It is the kind of plan a ruler makes when the treasury is feeling optimistic and papyrus is cheap by the cartload. The librarians wear linen and patience. They organized the world with a catalog, the Pinaques, compiled by Callimachus, who calmly listed authors, works, first lines, and subjects across hundreds of scrolls about scrolls. Imagine the world's thoughts turning into tidy entries, like a very long grocery list for the mind. On fishes, Aristotle begins of the kinds. On comedy, Menander begins with a complaint about rent. The Pinaques is lost now, which makes it even more efficient. It no longer needs to be updated. In the reading rooms, texts lived on rolls of papyrus so nicely rolled, they looked like cinnamon sticks for giants. Some rolls were thin, a single treatise in a comfortable hand. Others were thick as a good loaf because an author refused to be brief. Scribes sat with reed pens and ink made of soot and gum. A sharp knife trimmed the pen's tiny mouth when the letters grew tired. The copyists rolled faint lines so the text would not run downhill, glued sheets end to end with paste that smelled a little like honey, and left margins wide enough for a scholar to argue in miniature. A professional reader, hired for his lungs, dictated while several scribes wrote at once. This was early cloud computing, except the cloud coughed occasionally. Alexandria had a special acquisition strategy that scholars today would call bold. Incoming ships were politely invited to surrender any books they carried for a brief visit to the copying rooms. The state borrowed the originals, paid a handsome deposit, made excellent copies on fine papyrus, and then returned the copies to the owners while keeping the originals for the shelves. The receipts for this transaction called the originals from the ships, which is the kind of bureaucratic poetry nobody sets out to write. Traders learned to carry inexpensive manuscripts if they were in a hurry. It is said that the kings of Pergamon, who preferred parchment, tried to out-collect Alexandria until Egypt discreetly throttled papyrus exports in a gesture historians describe as firm but leafy. The library filled with Homer and histories, with medical handbooks and tragic choruses, with Egyptian wisdom literature so old it yawned politely, and with treatises in languages that required a special shelf and a special friend. Scholars argued about the shape of the earth in the morning, the shape of verbs in the afternoon, and the shape of dinner at dusk. An entire neighborhood near the palace became a campus where ideas were expected to behave indoors. The hunger for scrolls was not shy. Royal agents sent wish lists to book markets in Rhodes and Athens. Ambassadors returned from diplomatic missions carrying wrapped bundles that weighed more than their speeches. Eratosthenes measured the world with shadows and geometry, and wrote about it in a way that made the desert look like a protractor. Archimedes sent letters that opened like ingenious toys. Physicians debated recipes for eye salve that sound experimental even now. The city liked to say it contained all books worth having and several that needed editing, which is a boast, but harbor cities do love their boasts. On festivals, scholars read aloud under plane trees while youths fetched water and arguments. A stray cat walked across a wet ink line once and left tiny paw prints in the margin of a medical text. Every reader noticed them for 50 years and felt fond of the cat's opinion. When a new copy of a famous play arrived and the first line sounded wrong, the librarians quietly checked other copies and wrote little notes about variants. Correctness is a kind of kindness in a library. No one shouted about it. Then came smoke and rumors of smoke. In the year when Julius Caesar found himself tactically involved with ships in the harbor, a fire wandered across the waterfront like a guest who declines to leave. Warehouses burned, and the wind made editorial decisions no human had proposed. Did the flames reach the buildings of the library? Some say yes, as if catastrophe walked from boat to book in a single stride. Others say the worst loss was stores of papyrus waiting to be used, which would be tragic enough for any scribe who had inked a fresh pen that morning. Caesar, busy with survival and narrative framing, recorded what he needed to record and did not mention librarians running downstairs with armfuls of Sophocles. Alexandria kept breathing. Cleopatra later asked Rome for books and received them by the wagon, which suggests there were shelves with opinions waiting to be filled again. The library may have been singed, scolded, harried, then repaired in the way cities repair themselves with mortar and selective memory. Decline prefers to travel slowly. Dynasties change, treasuries thin, and stipends for scholars arrive with the dignity of late winter. Earthquakes push at coastal stones. Aurelian as soldiers fight street by street in the 3rd century and tidy the map by removing a palace quarter altogether. It is impolite for a library to stand once the surrounding neighborhood has vanished, and so the old cluster of halls near the palace loses its context and then its roof. Scholars migrate to the daughter collection at the Serapeum, a temple complex on higher ground with columns that felt taller in good weather. There, in quieter rooms, a second generation of shelves holds out against indifference. When the Serapeum's cult became a problem for a zealous bishop, and a city politics that had run out of patience, the buildings took the kind of damage that ends chapters in history books. Were there still books there then? Some, probably, because books are resilient and priests are often keen readers. But an institution can be wounded without flames touching a single scroll. It can die of budgets and fashion and the habitual preference of rulers for cavalry over librarians. The silent decline is not theatrical. It is cupboards emptying gradually, catalog entries that no longer get checked, a caretaker pressing his ear to it. Blame has always been good at finding a torch to hold. One version says the library perished in a clash of faiths, as if ideas could only live under one kind of sky. This makes tidy sense when whispered at dinner and does not match the messiness of cities very well. Alexandria had always argued loudly about the invisible. Its streets knew how to disagree and then buy figs from the same vendor. Another version assigns the end to a caliph's order centuries later, the story in which Commander Amr ibn al-Ji conquers a thoughtful city and writes to his superior for instructions, and the superior replies with the saddest syllogism in library history. If the books agree with the holy book, they are redundant. If they disagree, they are dangerous. Either way, heed the baths. It is a tale told late in comfortable prose, long after the last bath would have cooled, and historians raise eyebrows while counting the number of public baths and the number of days those baths would have needed to consume every scroll ever copied. The arithmetic yawns. Firewood exists. Even zeal develops a taste for easier fuel. The story survives because it is dramatic, and drama does love an especially bad decision. Between these grand accusations walk smaller culprits with better alibis. Insects, for instance, have eaten more libraries than most generals. A roll of papyrus is a well-appointed apartment for a beetle of the right philosophy. Damp air in a sea city turns glue sulky. Scribes go unpaid and open schools elsewhere. A catalog becomes less accurate each season, and after a while a shelf can only be described as miscellaneous. The building keeper retires, and the new one is a philosopher who forgets roofs. In one century, a flood will carry away a market but spare an archive. In another, the flood will aim more carefully. Add to this the steady reuse of writing material and hard times papyrus scraped to make room for ration lists. Palimpsests that look like ghosts arguing with themselves, and you begin to see how an empire of pages can fade without a villain. In cities as in gardens, neglect is not spectacular, but very efficient. What did the world lose other than several hectares of shelving and a handsome reputation? Names we still know left behind books we cannot touch. Sophocles wrote more plays than fit into modern anthologies. The missing ones lean like doors we never opened. Sappho's songs survive in shreds because papyrus is honest but not immortal. Hipparchus measured the sky and announced stellar discoveries that make later. Astronomers nod politely in the direction of a map that no longer exists. Eratosthenes calculated the earth and composed poems about rivers. We use the measurement and miss the poems. Hero tinkered with jets of steam that push small devices around like obedient beetles. His notebooks would be fun in any century. Callimachus compiled the Pinaques, a master catalog that would teach us how the early librarians organized their mountain of words. And the catalog itself vanished into the footnotes of dreams. Some medical treatises that combined observation with guesswork disappeared completely, which is perhaps merciful for patients and a pity for historians. Even the small things, the lists of tall ships, the jokes playwrights filed for later, the recipe a physician wrote in the margin for the strong wine that cures timidity, these are among the absent. There are survivors, of course, because ideas learn to pack a bag. Euclid's geometry walked out early and found lodging everywhere. A copy of Archimedes smuggled itself into a palimpsest and returned centuries later to applause. Fragments surfaced in the sands with a patience that embarrasses stone. The loss is not a blank wall. It is a garden with paths missing, where you can still walk, but occasionally find yourself looking at a hedge that clearly used to have a gate. The library's legend magnifies the loss until we imagine that somewhere on those shelves sat a manual for building pocket-sized thunder, or a map to unruinable politics, or a very short essay titled How to Be Nice. It probably did not. It probably held something better, 1,000 earnest attempts at describing the world as it appeared to people standing near a harbor full of light, written in careful hands that paused now and then to fix the nib. The older what if arrives in the evening and pulls up a chair. If Alexandria had continued, could the Renaissance have rehearsed itself earlier, with steam engines and tunics and eyeglasses worn by philosophers who preferred sandals? Perhaps. Or perhaps the library's secret was not invention but conversation. The place gathered languages that did not usually share lunch and made them argue kindly. It compared Indian arithmetic to Greek geometry, Egyptian numbers to Babylonian moons, Hebrew poetry to everything that takes a deep breath before speaking. That habit, once taught, does not fully vanish. It spreads the way recipes do. The library might not have unveiled machines centuries ahead. It might simply have shortened the time it takes for ideas to answer each other across maps. A city that likes to copy carefully and argue politely is already a machine for making mornings. It helps before sleep to picture the rooms at dusk. A scribe ties a ribbon around a roll and writes a small tag so a future hand will know what lives inside. A student unrolls a map that looks like a child's stream of rivers and says, "Aha," very softly. perhaps about the Nile, perhaps about dinner. A librarian locks a chest because a certain poet is prone to wandering off. Poets are like that. In the courtyard, the custodian shakes dust from a mat, which does not mind. Far off in the harbor, the masts tick against one another like wooden metronomes deciding on a very patient tempo. A breeze lifts the corners of labels and sets them down again, a rhythm that would lull beetles, much less scholars. If you are still awake, consider the smallest thing, the way a reed pen, cleaned at last, rests on a smooth stone, so that in the morning it will be kind. Consider also the way a rumor travels across centuries and loses its sharpness, becoming almost sweet, and the way a myth about bathhouses needs more fuel than a city can politely provide. Then let the rooms grow darker, and let the catalog that no longer exists continue to list the world, line by patient line, in a hand that never tires. You might not expect a king to try and organize the world the way a grocer organizes figs by crates and labels and hopeful neatness, but that is more or less how the great library of Alexandria begins quietly with a shelf in the royal imagination. The harbor was bright, the breakwaters behaved, and the new Macedonian pharaoh liked his ideas stacked in the same place as his dinner. He wanted a city where wisdom could stroll to lunch under a colonnade and come back with olive oil on its sandals. So a campus grew in the palace quarter, a garden of rooms and porches called the Mausian, the place of the muses, which sounds ceremonial and was also extremely practical. There were long refectories where scholars rehearsed the graceful art of not spilling lentil stew while discussing astronomy. There were walkways where philosophy could wear shade. And there were rooms for reading that smelled of papyrus, dust, and ink that had decided to become serious. If you managed to stay awake until we reached the part about how librarians measured scrolls with string to invoice copywork correctly, you can subscribe or you can drift away and let Callimachus finish the paperwork without you. He has thousands of entries to make and he isn't in a hurry. In those rooms, the book did not look like a book. It was a roll of papyrus, the color of dried straw, trimmed and glued sheet to sheet until a single treatise made a neat cylinder deep enough to require 2 hands. The roll lived with its friends in pigeonhole shelves, each labeled with a tag that dangled from a string like a polite name badge at a conference, where the speakers were very old and extremely certain. Copyists in linen tunics listened to a trained reader pronounce lines at a steady pace, while their reed pens scribbled in chorus, a kind of academic orchestra. When a pen's mouth tired, it was sharpened with a small, decisive knife. The tiny curls of reed fell like green confetti onto the scribe's lap. Margins were generous because scholars like to argue in small handwriting, and because a cat might step across wet ink, and everyone would want to keep the footprints. The library kept a catalog, the Pinaques, a monument of order composed by Callimachus, who listed authors, works, opening lines, and subjects with the serene energy of someone alphabetizing a thunderstorm. The catalog has not survived, which is helpful in a way. It will not need to be updated tonight. Alexandria acquired books with a method that would make a modern shipping clerk breathe into a paper bag. Every vessel entering the harbor was politely relieved of its manuscripts, which went straight to the copying rooms. The state purchased the originals with a kind of courtesy that keeps lawyers out of it, made excellent duplicates, and then returned the copies to the owners while keeping the originals for the shelves labeled "From the Ships." Traders learned to carry second-best texts for speed, the way you might travel with socks you wouldn't mind losing. Rail agents shopped book markets from Rhodes to Athens with lists long enough to be mistaken for poetry. A diplomat could come home from a successful treaty and still be judged by whether he had found a better version of Homer along the way. The Mausian ran like a monastery that served arguments instead of prayers. In the morning, you might meet a geographer measuring the world with shadows. At lunch, a grammarian measuring vocabulary with more vocabulary. In the afternoon, a physician measuring pulse with fingers that remembered many names for the color red. Each measurement ended up on a roll that looked, to an outsider, exactly like every other roll. Librarians learned to keep a straight face when someone asked for the book on the Nile. Harbor wines mixed gossip with the salt air. Pergamon favored parchment and began its own collection. Egypt, protective of its papyrus reputation, sent fewer reeds upriver. And you can see how trade embargoes in literature became roommates. The library's appetite was not shy. Scholars borrowed copies from private houses, from temple shelves, from ships that had only wanted to unload grain, and found themselves unloading Hesiod as well. On festival days, poets recited under plane trees, and if a line sounded not quite Homeric, the head of the library raised one eyebrow and made a note to check variant readings after supper. The place moved at the pace of a patient beehive. Even the rumors were industrious. One said that when a scroll was so long it needed 2 hands, librarians tied a ribbon at the place a famous scholar had stopped reading, as if excellence were a bookmark. Whether that happened or not, the idea makes a pleasant, drowsy picture, learned men sleeping on benches in the shade, string dangling from a cylinder of papyrus, wisdom agreeing to wait until after a nap. All great institutions collect shadows the way porches collect leaves. In one of those energetic Roman years, Julius Caesar found himself fighting in a city that did not ask for flames and received them anyway. Warehouses along the waterfront burned with the frankness of wood doing what wood does. The wind, which is always pleased with its own influence, pushed smoke and sparks in directions that made later historians feel busy. Did the fire reach the royal quarter and graze the library? Some accounts say yes, as if tragedy adored geography. Others say the damage fell on papyrus stores, the raw material, not yet thought so that a scribe at his desk could have looked at the sky, shaken his pen, and said, "That is going to be inconvenient," and then kept writing. Cleopatra later asked for books from Rome and received many, which is the sort of exchange a city makes when shelves have opinions but need filling. A library can be singed without losing its personality. Alexandria had a habit of rebuilding. The lighthouse had been repaired before. The books could be too. Decline, when it wants to be effective, comes dressed as routine. Stipends shrink. A clerk with a talent for ordering scrolls takes a job in a law office where the pay arrives in more obedient fashion. A roof waits a season too long for maintenance and learns to listen to rain. There is a war, because it is the Mediterranean and the 3rd century is excellent at scheduling them. Soldiers retake quarters street by street, and a part of the palace district loses its architecture and then its name. The Serapeum, on higher ground, with its generous courtyards and friendly columns, gathers the surviving books like relatives looking after one another's houseplants. There, copyists still kneel to the task, and priests who appreciate footnotes share space with poets who forget to whisper. But the city changes languages and moods. The long patience of copying grows less fashionable. A building can go on standing while its purpose evaporates. You can have a reading room where the chairs become more numerous than the readers, and no one will think to complain in the registers because the registers have not been filled in for a decade. People enjoy assigning blame as if history were a neat courtroom with plentiful benches. One story says the library died in a war of religions, that zeal raised a hammer and the shelves stood very still and allowed it. It is a story made of sharp lines and it photographs well. Another says a conqueror centuries later wrote to his caliph to ask what to do with so many books, and received the most discouraging syllogism in library history. If these works agree with scripture, they are redundant. If they disagree, they are harmful. Let them heat the baths. The tale arrives late, well-dressed, and smells faintly of moralizing ink. The arithmetic refuses to cooperate. Even a city fond of bathing prefers firewood that does not require indexes. Meanwhile, the quieter culprits walk past the witness stand, beetles with excellent appetites, damp air that puckers glue, the frugality that scrapes writing from a sheet and uses it again because politics has moved in and needs tallies in a hurry. Decline is not a single torch rushing down an aisle. It is 100 tiny mouths and not enough hands to tuck the edges of pages back in. If there is a villain, it might be forgetfulness with a gentle face. A city shifts its curriculum. Roads require funds, not commentaries. A storm salts the storerooms. A prefect decides that the catalog can wait another year, and then decides it again. A boy who would have become a librarian becomes a shipwright and is happy with wood. Now and then, a tolerant official says, "Let us keep the temple, but remove the old cult." And it turns out that devotion makes a very good bookbinder, and that when devotion leaves, dust arrives early. A century later, a traveler asks where the famous library stood, and his guide gestures in a direction that is part memory, part guess, part pride. You can still stand there now, under the modern city that has taken that ancient city's hand, and listen hard enough to hear scholars disagree politely about vowels. What then stepped into the dark? Pieces of plays that never found a second stage. Sophocles is a celebrity made mostly of missing persons. The rest of his tragedies are probably fine and probably contained choruses who are right about everything. Philosophical dialogues that manage to be more patient than the ones we have. Medical recipes that combine observation with herbs that sound like a garden arguing with itself. Hipparchus's fuller catalog of stars, the one that allowed later astronomers to point politely and say, "It moved." Treatises on machines that blew small jets of steam and pushed toys around a table. Inventions that learned to be delightful before they learned to be useful. A geometry book with a tidy proof Euclid perfected, and then did not need to revisit because it fitted so well it snapped. The loss is not a blankness, but a different shape of path. We walk through a garden in which a few gates lead only to hedges, and we become good at enjoying hedges. But some items escaped as if the muses taught them to swim. Euclid found homes everywhere. You can bump into him in a hardware store when two boards meet at right angles, and everyone agrees that is pretty. A battered copy of Archimedes hid under prayers for centuries, and raised its hand only when light and patience met the page. A few Egyptian stories traveled anonymously and were adopted, like dogs who remember their first name but answer to anything kind. The habit of commentary which Alexandria loved. Went abroad and learned to wear many hats. In monasteries it became glosses with tidy letters. At universities it became lectures with tidy jokes. On maritime charts it became drawings of fish who look proud of themselves. Conversation, more than invention, may be the library's most stubborn export. The favorite late-night question is whether an unbroken Alexandria would have delivered an earlier Renaissance with cozy steam engines and spectacles worn by men in white linen. Perhaps the machines would have stayed charming and the conversation would have moved faster. Perhaps an early textbook on nervous systems would have spared someone a headache, and an atlas would have located a river that preferred to be found. But the library's best trick may never have been acceleration. It may have been hospitality. The shelves seated languages that did not meet elsewhere. Grammar shook hands with mathematics without sighing. Indian numbers could visit Greek geometry and discover that they liked the same food. Jewish poets swapped metaphors with Egyptian priests and became fond of each other's afternoons. If you put that habit into a city and leave it long enough, the city learns to talk to itself kindly. And kindness, even among footnotes, changes calendars more than smoke ever does. Picture the rooms again, but toward the end of the day. A scribe finishes a clean copy of a play and ties a ribbon at precisely the same place a previous reader stopped to laugh. A student turns a roll within its case and hears the papyrus sigh the way paper sighs when it knows it is useful. A librarian replaces a small clay tag that has fallen from its string and mutters the author's name in a way that sounds like affection. In the courtyard, A tree throws a leaf on the stone, and it looks like a comma, a pause the wind meant to add to a sentence. Far away, the lighthouse keeps its own argument with fog, and its argument has a rhythm that does not mind being slow. If you are awake, you may consider the unlikely luck of any book that survives an afternoon, much less an empire. If you are sleepy, you may allow the catalog that no longer exists to go on listing the world in a neat hand, because that is its pleasure. And if you sleep altogether, as scholars have done in reading rooms since benches were invented, Alexandria will not mind. It understood from the beginning that a city built to collect wisdom must also provide places to dream near it. You might not expect justice to be measured by a dripping bowl, but for a long, quiet stretch of history, time itself slid down the inside of clay like a very punctual snail. The water clock clepsydra, if you like the Greek mouthfeel, was a bowl with a hole whose entire personality was patience. It appears first in desert kingdoms that were very serious about irrigation and bedtime, then learns new tricks in Egypt. And later it moves into Greek law courts, where the jurors sat in rows and watched arguments advance one slow droplet at a time. Orators in Athens lived by the sound of it. A fast talker could do nothing about the hole in the bottom. A clerk filled the jar, set it on a little stand, and the law began to move the way water moves when there is no reason to hurry. If you are still awake by the time I discuss how speech time was paused while the court usher brought witnesses, but not paused while the orator told. Jokes you may subscribe, or you may let the clock do its work without you. It has been doing this for 25 centuries and needs no supervision. At first the device was shy and simple. A small pot with a neat puncture near the base, sometimes not much bigger than a soup bowl, and a second pot below to catch the verdict. On the inside of the upper vessel, lines scratched by a careful hand announced what hour lived at which height. A scribe would coat his fingertip in lampblack and run it across the marks to make them more legible. The way a teacher bolts a heading, no one will read. Egypt had grander versions that inhaled and exhaled water between vessels like thoughtful lungs, so that the hours remained almost honest in summer heat and winter dawn. In one temple, a priest began the day by pouring from a jar that had cooled overnight in a stone basin. He said he was watering the morning. The water declined to comment, but the drips kept coming, each one a tiny agreement between gravity and craftsmanship. The Greeks noticed that water behaves differently on days when the air remembers the sea, and that warm hours can make holes arrogant, so they tuned the device. Athenian court clocks were calibrated with sand and string, and an argument that never ended about whether the hole should be the width of a grain of barley or 2/3 of one, which is exactly the kind of disagreement that keeps civilization polite. When the trial was a capital case, a larger vessel, sometimes painted with a little eye that appeared to be paying attention, was brought out to give sorrow its full measure. Lesser matters settled for smaller jars, useful in the way smaller jars are useful everywhere. A bailiff stood by with a jug and the solemn face of a man who knew that if he spilled any, the afternoon would last forever. Scholars in the Mausian at Alexandria later made more elaborate models that pretended to tell the actual hour rather than only how long, and these models had little floats, tied to cords that raised tiny figurines at the top of each hour like dignified cuckoos. Time, which had begun as a leak, acquired props. Ships carried clepsydras because sailors liked trustworthy rhythm, and cities carried them into market halls where a vendor might offer measures of oil until the third scratch, a phrase that means very little to us now and everything to someone in a linen apron. Doctors timed the pulse with a palm and a cup, and a medical student was once told to pour until the patient's forehead stopped glistening. It was a very gentle prescription. Astronomers, friends of the slow, used large bronze basins at night to count the seconds between star risings, though they did not call them seconds yet. They called them a little while, which is accurate and restful. In one observatory, an apprentice nodded off in the middle of a meteor shower and woke to find the basin calmly empty, which made his notes look philosophical. When the Romans adopted the device, they gave it furniture, a tall stand, sometimes carved with leaves, and moved it into baths. Only one complaint circulated widely. The clocks did not travel well over rutted streets, and the bailiffs developed a habit of arriving with their water already in motion. Fire, of course, loves equipment. There were years when warehouses in the harbor quarter burned, and years when armies quarreled near roofs, and years when a clerk left a lamp too close to a shelf of dried cords and discovered how quickly a slow device can end. Yet the worst enemy of water time was not flame but silence. A clock set aside varies from a clock destroyed only in drama. Both keep nothing. As temples changed their staff and courts their forms, the vessels became objects without a job. In one city, mechanical contraptions, gears, weights, the clever rattle of teeth moved into church towers. And monasteries and calendars became audible in the square as bells rang on time, whether anyone asked or not. The clepsydra could not ring. It could only continue to be good at being itself, a noble habit that does not always win elections. There were still households where a small bowl on a shelf measured the afternoon nap for a merchant's grandmother, and she insisted that good soup should simmer for half a lawsuit. But the big public clocks took the plazas and water. Relieved of duty, returned to cooking and laundry. Blame, when the device failed, fell with great creativity. Orators accused rivals of cooling their jars with snow to slow the flow, which is the kind of luxury accusation that doubles as envy. One man claimed the opposing party had rubbed the inside with oil to make the drops slicker. And unfairly quick, and the magistrate examined the pot with the care of a sommelier, evaluating a suspect wine. Another swore that someone had drilled a hole witlessly elliptical, which is an insult to geometry more than to law. In some places, boys put fish in the lower basin and declared the timing invalid on the grounds of distraction. In others, an impatient clerk simply opened a second little hole and announced that everyone would speak more briefly now. Monks in later centuries liked to blame weather for missed prayers, and therefore wrapped their water clocks in cloaks, as if time itself could take a chill. A visitor once saw one such cloak hung over a pot, and wrote in his diary that the brethren had dressed the hour for Mass. Under all that whimsy lay the dull physics that make sleep easier to find. Water refuses to flow at the same speed when it is cold as when it is warm. And without a regulator, the last inch in a bowl sneaks out more slowly than the first, a familiar trait in other areas of life. Makers responded with a second vessel that maintained constant head pressure, which is a phrase that sounds like a complaint and is in fact a kindness. They kept a little tank above the main one so that the whole always felt the weight of the same height of water. Some made the outflow creep across a flat plate with a groove laid in a spiral, so that a floating cork could announce the hour by walking outward like a patient ant toward the rim. The most ambitious built automata small door opening to reveal a bronze man who lifted his arm and then politely shut the door again. A performance as satisfying the seventh time as the first because it suggested lunch would arrive at some point. These improvements worked best when someone remembered to clean the hole. One surviving instruction tablet from a temple says, with suspicious emphasis, "Let no grain lodge there," which tells you exactly what always happened next. The clock had cousins. In India, a tiny basin, sometimes a coconut shell, was pierced so it would sink precisely in 60 counts, an arrangement that distracted people helpfully at festivals. In China, great towers with flowing reservoirs and geared escapements were devised by engineers who liked dragons and practical certainty in equal measure. An observer described a parade of wooden officials appearing on schedule from upper windows and bowing a team of bureaucracy in miniature. In the Islamic world, where mathematicians treated water as a respectable colleague, treatises balance elegance and plumbing so that a bowl might drip steadily for the length of a recitation and then ring a little bell operated by a float that tugged a string. One court engineer wrote that he aligned his device with the length of the shadow from a certain windowsill at mid-morning. It is a detail you can feel with your fingers. These clocks allow people on 3 continents to coordinate incense and wages with believable harmony, which is all most communities ask. Replacement arrived as quietly as moss. Weight-driven clocks made time less negotiable. Bells ignored fog and the thoughts of magistrates. A monastery with an early mechanical clock discovered that brothers stopped consulting the stars to schedule prayers and simply listened for iron. City councils gained a tool for fines, and markets built etiquette around the striking of hours. Water time, which had always been tactile and visible, you could point at it, became a background hum, a number on a face. A few clerks kept clepsydras as backups for days when the newer machine sulked. In one town, a scribe insisted on using water for legal oaths because he did not trust iron to pity human nerves. He said water was a witness who understood trembling. But he retired, and no one wrote down his method for cleaning algae without scratching the inner marks. The next generation found the vessel in a cupboard, admired the craftsmanship, and repurposed it for pickled radishes, which is an honorable fate for anything honest and round. We like to imagine that knowledge disappears in a blaze, but most of what vanished with water time slipped away, folded inside ordinary forgetfulness. A manual on how to cut the hole so that the flow remained graceful in winter is probably lost under a demolished threshold. The exact recipe for the pitch used to seal a joint might live only as a smell in the mind of someone who also remembers the sound of sandals on courtroom stone. A poem comparing the spill of a clepsydra to the unspooling of a letter written by a clerk with romance in his pockets is likely gone, which will not hurt the world but would have pleased a few evenings. Treatises that tried to reconcile hours with shadows, songs with schedules, and harvests with hearings drifted into other books, and their authors, who never minded much about fame, would not mind about that either. What we still have is the habit of measuring with something close at hand and being almost satisfied. A habit that builds calendars and grocery lists and 1,000 quiet compromises. What remains, too, is the texture. A clerk braces a bowl with one hand while pouring with the other, his sleeve rolled to his elbow, the ash of a spent lamp on his wrist like a smudge of midnight. A boy tasked with carrying the lower basin of the court steps feels a thin ring of cold water lick over his sandal, and wonders if this is an omen for the accused. He will later decide it was, and feel wise each time a verdict agrees with his feet. An astronomer counts drips between 2 pale stars and miscounts at the 700th because his throat asks for water. He writes a small mark in the margin shaped like a pitcher and a moon, a symbol no one else will ever interpret correctly. In a kitchen, a woman teaches a girl to let stew go, 3 finger breadths down the inside, which is familial clepsydra talk, and the girl believes for the rest of her life that this is the correct portion of patience for lentils. A monk's robe touches the vessel's lip and leaves a soft thread behind, which goes on traveling with the flow as if time were wool. If you are still with me, and many fell asleep somewhere around the bit about constant head pressure, which is perfectly fine, you may like the small ironies. The word clepsydra means water thief, which is an unfair reputation for a tool that only ever returns what it borrows. Court speakers learned to break their arguments into gulps that matched drips, so that rhetoric developed a slightly aquatic gait. When later readers call their style flowing, they are using a metaphor with a surprisingly literal grandmother. And there were people who discovered that if they leaned close to a good clock and listened, they relaxed, because each drop sounded like a busy task that belonged to someone else. In this sense, the device did duty as a therapist long before therapists developed couch etiquette. It measured not only minutes, but also calm, and the fact that it did both without hurry is the entire thesis of this episode. Mechanical time rules most rooms now, and the courts prefer exhibits and folders to bowls on stands, but the old logic remains oddly persuasive at midnight. If you need to be persuaded to bed, imagine a clear stream running through a small round hole into a waiting saucer, and with each drop, a voice in the next room says, "Enough for now." Imagine a clerk in a linen tunic blotting the inside marks with soot so that they show in the lamplight, a careful handwriting you can't read, but trust anyway. Imagine the next drop and the next, consistent as the breathing of a cat. You may plan to count them because humans enjoy counting things that were not designed to be counted. And you may reach 15 or 72 or 400 and then lose track happily. The court adjourns. The stew is done. The star has cleared the roofline. The pulse is steady. The night stands still and then does not. The bowl is a little lower than it was, and tomorrow someone will refill it, which is the best definition of civilization I can offer before sleep. You might not expect a library to begin with a dream about quietly rearranging the world, but that is more or less how the story drifts in. A ruler in a bright white palace, calling himself a pharaoh, though the crown had a Greek accent, imagines a building that contains everything worth knowing and a fair amount that isn't. He does not ask for drama. He asks for drawers. He asks for order. He asks for a long corridor where a scholar can start with arithmetic and, by the time the lamps are lit, end at astronomy without ever stepping outdoors. He pictures the map of the sea blue enough to hush the mind, and then decides the sea itself should come to his shelves. The city is young and vain, and it hums like a jar full of bees, and the idea of knowledge in jars pleases him. In that early morning mood, when plans are obvious and consequences sleepy, ships become pages, harbors become indexes, and a library becomes a way of convincing time to file itself properly. If you are still awake by the time I get to the rumor about heating public baths with philosophy, you're welcome to subscribe in your head, or simply let the story do the shelving for you. The library will not check. It is said that orders went out with a regular cargo list: grain, wine, papyrus, and with an underlined flourish, books. Not clean copies, any copy. Scrolls with coffee-colored fingerprints. Business letters written on the back of tragedies. Treatises that insisted the moon controlled vegetables. The harbor inspector learned a new ritual. He would climb a gangplank, look for rope-bound cylinders, and make the kind of apologetic face that means the law is about to be very polite and very firm at the same time. The texts were borrowed, copied by swift hands, and returned as duplicates, which is to say the ship sailed away with something that looked exactly like its original, except for the tiny difference of not being the original. The word for these was from the ships, a category name that sounds like a sigh of relief. Inside the storehouses, clerks stitched labels onto narrow wooden tags and tied them to the ends of scrolls, because a good librarian knows every book is mostly a cylinder of anxiety until you give it a title. A scholar who had followed the Nile north with a bag full of hymns found his work queued between a manual on olive presses and a commentary on dreams, which is a shelving decision that would make sense to someone who has tried both sleep and oil. The ruler's dream grew appendices. There were rooms for translation where half a dozen languages sat together like cats, pretending not to notice one another. There were catalogs, sensible ones at first, and then magnificent ones that cataloged the catalogs. There was a man whose job was to standardize author names because not every poet agreed on how to spell his own. A quiet clerk scratched tiny symbols at the edge of papyrus sheets to mark meters and rhetorical hiccups, the earliest proofreading size. Messengers carried invitations upriver and across islands, offering stipends and sunshine and the promise that one's students would always have sharp pens. Abroad, people joked that Alexandria collected authors the way a child collects smooth stones. And it was true, except that stones asked fewer questions about food and rent, The library was never a single room. It was a neighborhood with paper in its pores. You could tell you were near it by the smell of gum arabic and the elegant cough of someone who has just inhaled a plume of carbon ink. Every collection needs a hunger story, and this one has ships arriving from the ends of every compass point, their holds full of textiles and their cabins full of news. The library learned to open letters carefully, copy them, and reseal them with a more symmetrical seal, which is not espionage so much as a tidying impulse that got out of bed early. Mariners brought calendars that behaved themselves in certain winds. Merchants brought recipes for bright powders that made wool pretend to be royal. A traveler from far away handed over a piece of bark with a map scratched in lines that looked like a child's idea of lightning. He claimed it showed a road that always arrived somewhere on time, which is a suspicious claim, but one the library dutifully archived. A pair of doctors arrived with jars of preserved lizards labeled "only for demonstration," a phrase that has soothed students in every century. Somewhere in a side court, a mathematician drew a perfect circle with a piece of string and then ate figs while everyone else discussed what it meant. The city as scriptorium learned to run at 2 speeds, glacial for accuracy and merely slow for everything else. At a festival, the director tried to weigh all the scrolls at once, a ceremonial gesture that collapsed into laughter because knowledge refuses to stand still on a scale. The library accepted the joke and wrote it down anyway, because even jokes are data if you squint. Flames arrive in this narrative the way summer arrives, gradually and then everywhere at once in someone's memory. There was fighting in the harbor district, and a general who preferred the boldness of fire to the boredom of strategy let the docks erupt like a string of matches. The warehouses sighed. The wind chose a direction. The city began to argue with itself about whether the stacks near the shore were part of the library or only cousins. A clerk interviewed later insisted he saw sparks jump from warehouse roofs to the edges of a reading room and die for lack of enthusiasm. Someone else swore the lamp oil did the rest. You can pick any version you like. In some tellings, the blaze was an accident. In others, a tactic. And in others, a very useful excuse. It is odd how many disasters that involve books also involve people who mean well, and friends who promise that the smoke is under control. When the ash settled, the shelves were dusty and the staff were tired, and the institution performed its oldest trick. It continued. New scrolls arrive in old cities every day. The harbor reopened, the bees returned to their jar, and the librarians added a line to their evacuation plan that read, in a neat hand, "Move the best first." Destruction, if we are being honest, is less a single event than a lifestyle. Centuries are very good at misplacing things without help. The library's roofs required attention, and roofs have a talent for waiting until funds are late. The ink makers argued about recipes and produced a generation of letters that faded in a single summer like shy footprints. Mice brought their families to live among philosophy. A governor decided he liked birds more than books and turned one of the courtyards into an aviary, which worried the copyists until the parrots learned to say hush. The city had earthquakes, minor ones mostly, the kind that rearranged jars in confidence, and the staff learned to pick scrolls off the floor with one hand while studying a shelf with the other. Politics switched emperors the way a distracted reader switches topics. The library's budget was sometimes reliable, sometimes theoretical. An old scholar retired with his personal notes and a sense of ceremony. A young one counted the blank spaces left by thefts and shrugged, because every large collection quietly negotiates with absence. In one melancholy winter, a clerk recorded that the lamps smoked more than usual and that the walls wept tiny crystals of salt. He meant humidity, but the line reads like a poem. And maybe that is how institutions remember their own decline, as housekeeping. People love assigning guilt almost as much as they love commas. A religious crowd decided that certain texts were made of dangerous ideas, and that the safest fate for danger is to become warm air. Another crowd decided that the first crowd was only being practical. A general marched through a temple with a stubborn, glittering smile and left with victory and a city that felt quieter than it should have. A philosopher was killed in a way that made students leave. No library endures a long season of silence from its students without losing track of itself. Later historians, standing at comfortable distances, developed the habit of telling the story as a duel between faiths, which makes a tidy paragraph but a messy day. The truth is that libraries die from many small reasons that look a lot like errands: a gap in a budget, a grudge in a council, a shutter that no longer closes against rain. It is tempting to imagine one decisive night with a decisive fire. The slower version is nothing like a tale and everything like life. Then there is the warm rumor that will not retire. The story of a caliph and an order and public baths made cheerful by the combustion of knowledge. It is told with great confidence in vineyards and with small shrugs in archives. In one version, a pious ruler explains that if the books agree with Holy Writ, they are unnecessary, and if they disagree, they are undesirable, which is at least a consistent filing system. In another version, someone practical simply sees fuel stacked in cylinders and thinks of winter. The trouble is that the tale arrives centuries late to its own party, and the friend who swears it happened cannot produce an invitation. Historians trace it the way one traces a joke back to the person who first told it too well. Yet imagine, if you find it comforting, the murmur of the bathhouse, the tiled walls sweating contentment, the pipes clucking, the faces pink, and the library contributing quietly to the temperature of an evening. Philosophy in such a picture becomes steam. It is a domestic metaphor for loss and a reminder that people turn every resource into warmth if the night is long. What went missing, whether in a roar or a yawn, is easier to feel than to count. Maps that tried to describe the edges of the known world with diagrams of winds and small whales would have been amusing company in any weather. A shelf of engineers' daydream siphons, signaling fires. A proposal for a machine that could lift water out of a well using buckets and stubborn optimism might have saved a century of clumsy experiments. A physician's notes on fevers that moved through a garrison and then moved out again after the soldiers discovered sleep. Lemons and shade could have shortened someone else's bad season. A drawer full of jokes and languages now quiet might have taught us that people in every century have laughed at goats in exactly the same way. One hopes there were recipes for adhesives that do not mind summer, for ink that does, for the practical alchemy of kitchens. Perhaps even the draft of a letter from a mathematician to a friend, explaining how he finally learned to let a problem ripen instead of chasing it around the room. We could use that letter. The library's true treasure was not so much answers as the habit of keeping questions in one place until they grew calm and legible. There is a fashionable thought experiment in which the library survives every draft and repair and becomes a machine for shortening the night of ignorance, which is a dramatic way of saying people would have had more footnotes. Imagine translations moving faster, not like a race, but like a well-fed river, smoothing the stones of misunderstanding. Imagine standards for measurement that travel by ship with the same reliability as amphorae of wine, so that a builder in one port and a builder in another can speak with rulers instead of metaphors. Perhaps the habits of citing and checking, those small courtesies that make modern science slightly less chaotic than a flock of gulls, arrive earlier. Maybe we get lenses ground with better patience, and a doctor sees something in an eye and writes a plain sentence that later doctors can improve. Or maybe the world remains itself, but with softer elbows. Even a surviving library would still have pests, ancient grudges over office space, and the eternal argument about whether poetry belongs with mathematics or opposite it. The perfect archive is a myth. The possible archive is a neighborhood that remembers your name. That would have been enough. And a room that no map records. Where the floor remembers the tide and the windows are kind to wind, a scribe leans on his left elbow and copies a line about the stars. He pauses not for wisdom but to stretch, and the lamp smokes a little and then decides not to. In the courtyard, someone argues amiably about the price of dates and loses by exactly 3 figs. A visitor runs a finger over a row of tags and stops at one labeled with a name he doesn't know. The tiny shock of finding a stranger who might have been a friend. Far away, a ship swings at anchor and the harbor master yawns, both of them connected to the shelves by a very thin rope of promises. Night thickens. The library, as all libraries do, rearranges itself by half a thought. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the papyrus soften to the temperature of the room. Somewhere a story is being borrowed and will be returned, not precisely the same, but still itself. If sleep arrives before the borrower, that is fine. The lamps will burn a while longer, and then not, and then again, and the city will wake to a morning that smells faintly of ink and sea, and the kind of order that forgives you for losing your place. You might not think a world-famous library would begin with a bored customs officer and a coil of rope, but that is roughly where the tale likes to start. A ship drifts into the Alexandrian harbor, part perfume, part fish, and part rumor. The clerk who checks manifests is not searching for olives or cedar. He is looking for cylinders of papyrus tied with string, because the city has a habit of borrowing anything wrapped like a thought. Somewhere behind him, the ruler with a Greek name and an Egyptian crown has decided that knowledge should be gathered the way gardeners collect dew, quietly and in quantity. It is not a dramatic decision. It is the slow, careful kind that thinks about labels and sunlight and how far shelves should be from windows. If you're still awake by the time I reach the bit about warming public baths with philosophy, you're welcome to subscribe with a sigh or not. The librarians will never audit your dreams dot in the quiet of the palace. A plan grows with the steady confidence of an accountant's handwriting. If the world holds wisdom, then we will invite it to live in one city, says the plan, and we will sort it until even midnight understands what belongs next to what. The Ptolemaic court sketches courtyards, where scribes can copy without sneezing, and rooms where translators can argue about the word for horizon without scaring the mathematicians. The director of this operation, tidy in sandals, sends out letters to scholars who have become suspiciously famous for remembering things. The offer is simple: free food, comfortable stipends, an audience that does not yawn, and as many clean sheets of papyrus as the Nile can bribe out of its own reeds. We call this the birth of a legend because a long sequence of bureaucratic successes does not sing. And yet it is the sort of legend that wins every day it remains slightly boring. Ships help. They always do. The harbor master learns a new phrase, books from the ships, which sounds like a blessing and functions like a policy. When a vessel ties up, anything resembling a text is carried gently to a scribal room, copied with ink the color of old tea, and returned to the owner. With thanks, a duplicate, and the kind of smile that says kindly that duplicates are quite nice. The library keeps the original, which is a clever plan if you are the library, and a merely tolerable plan if you are the captain. Callimachus, a poet with a librarian spine, begins the great catalogues, lists of lists of lists, so that a reader can find a treatise on cart axles without accidentally learning astronomy. Margins acquire their own life, small symbols for jokes, corrections, and the places where the author appears to have argued with himself and won. A scholar who arrives with 3 hymns and a cold leaves with a better cough and a generous supply of citations, the city itself becomes an annex. The museum, which is less a museum and more a community of minds, grows dining halls where the conversation is the furniture. Translators show off like jugglers by keeping 2 alphabets in the air at once. One man standardizes author names, an occupation that causes more trouble than war. Another starts measuring shadows, notices the sun's angle at different wells, and writes a note that gently informs the world it is larger than it thought, which is a polite way to ruin certain maps. In a smaller room, someone marks rhythmic feet on the edges of tragedies, the first known time that poetry has been asked to wear shoes. If you imagine the place as a single building, it escapes you. It is a neighborhood where the walls are fond of glue and light. When the tale turns toward flames, it arrives with the languid precision of a summer draft. There is fighting near the docks, and a general whose name school children must memorize decides that fire is a quicker negotiator than patience. Warehouses think about being flammable, and then they are. The city later argues with itself about whether those particular warehouses counted as part of the library or as cousins who lived by the sea and borrowed money. A clerk, the sort who notices how lamps behave on humid days, writes that the sparks jumped and then sat down again, tired. Another says the burned grain made its own weather. The truth wipes its hands and refuses to testify. Afterward, the port smells like regret and cooked rope. The scribes brush ash from scrolls with peacock feathers, and the library does what all institutions do after a scare. It believes in tomorrow with slightly less enthusiasm and slightly more procedure. Decline rarely submits to a single date. It prefers habit. Roofs leak in quiet corners and then in louder ones. Mice discover that papyrus pairs well with midnight. A governor who loves birds more than books requisitions a courtyard and fills it with parrots who learn after a month to say hush with perfect phrasing. The ink recipe is adjusted by a thrifty quartermaster, and an entire decade of copies fades early, as if embarrassed by its own existence. Budgets appear on time and then, with a politician's shrug, do not. A reader stops coming because his teacher has been exiled. A reader starts coming because gossip says the catalogs are a labyrinth worth getting lost in. Over generations, a library can die from gentle reasons, mildew, misfiled law, and the slow replacement of wonder with errands. The city keeps promising to make a list of repairs that turns, by force of hope, into a plan, and then into a folder, and then into a memory of a folder. Blame looks for a costume. One century prefers to dress it as a duel between faiths. Another prefers to blame philosophers for being inconvenient in public. A third chooses the safety of vagueness. Events occurred. The famous story of the philosopher murdered in the street, an incident sharpened by hindsight until it clicks like a latch drifts into the library's legend because students leaving a city can thin a catalog faster than rats. Somewhere in these years, the Serapeum, a temple that had become the library's dignified satellite, is embraced by riot and policy at the same time. Later tellers choose their favorite villain. Earlier witnesses, those reliable enemies of neatness, scribble contradictions. The safest answer is a sleepy one. Shelves were lost the way coastlines erode, through repeated conversations with weather and authority. And then there is the bathhouse rumor, warm and confident, about a caliph who turned books into steam. It arrives late to its own century, introduces itself with a joke, and is therefore loved. In the version most likely to be repeated by uncles, the ruler explains that if the scrolls agree with Holy Writ, they are redundant, and if they disagree, they are dangerous, and so either way, the baths will benefit. The logistical problems are Legion papyrus burns fast. Fuel chains prefer predictability. Bath attendants enjoy calm, not cartloads of Aristotle, but rumors rarely submit to logistics. Historians, those persistent doubters, track the tale. To a storyteller who liked a good line more than a good source. Still, the image is hard to resist. Citizens lounging in the fog of evaporated knowledge, discussing the weather while Heraclitus quietly contributes to the temperature. If it helps, you sleep to imagine that it would not be the worst comfort. What was lost is easier to imagine than to inventory. Maps, yes, full of wind roses and small fish that double as warnings about shoals. Manuals on machines that humbly lift water using levers and faith. Texts that might have saved a century. Of backstream. Plays whose jokes would make sense today because goats and politics have not changed. Recipes for ink that refuses to fade, glue that apologizes to humidity, and linen size to resist the ambitions of beetles. Letters between stubborn mathematicians explaining, with affectionate exasperation, why the other's proof feels like a chair with one short leg. Lists of plants that treat headaches by smelling like the absence of headaches. Perhaps even a drawer labeled unreliable devices, containing designs that admit their own failure in the margins and yet teach elegance by accident. The library's best gift was not authority. It was a stack of drafts. The counterfactual game tempts even drowsy minds. If the library had lived without interruption, repairing its roofs, refreshing its staff, holding on to its habit of arguing politely, would the world have hurried? Maybe translations would have walked instead of limped. Maybe calendar reforms would have been announced with less quarrel and more bread. Standards for weights might have agreed with themselves sooner, sparing merchants the daily drama of arguing over comment. A lens maker, funded by a librarian who hates squinting, could have ground glass a little thinner and taught a doctor to watch a capillary without guessing. Or nothing kaleidoscopic occurs at all. Perhaps we simply inherit better footnotes and a tradition of omitting the dramatic flourish when the tidy sentence will do. As modern as we feel, our most useful institutions still resemble that neighborhood by the sea. Rooms, names, schedules, and the gentle discipline of keeping the kettle just under a boil. Meanwhile, the old city persists as a smell ink and salt and baked bricks cooling in the afternoon. A scribe rests his wrist and keeps a stone on the papyrus to remind the sheet to stay put. A pupil carries a basket of figs, 2 short scrolls, and a question about eclipses. Pigeons hold committee on the cornice and find consensus reprehensible. In the reading garden, someone describes the moon's influence on vegetables with a sort of conviction that prefaces correction. The head librarian, a patient tyrant over labels, orders new tags made from olive wood because the pine ones splinter. You can almost hear the scrape of the stylus and the murmurs that follow a solved riddle, that modest applause of breath. The library's day is not dramatic. It is a sequence of small obediences to curiosity. Eventually, the story slows, the way lamp oil does when it contemplates sleep. The catalog is never finished, and therefore always hospitable. The last scholar of the night adjusts a wick with a pen, because the flame is a reader and poor lighting makes even fire irritable. Outside, water taps the keys. Inside, someone closes a storage chest, which is just a wooden way of saying until morning. The city will argue again tomorrow about budgets, tenants, repairs, and whether poetry should be near mathematics or far away. And the library will pretend to listen while quietly expanding a shelf. If your eyes are heavy, that is the correct response. Ancient Alexandria understood that a good collection is simply a very methodical lullaby, and then, because we promised to follow our simple rhythm, let us drift back to the customs officer. With the rope and the practiced shrug, he steps onto another gangplank and finds a cylinder wrapped in old cloth, tied with care that implies secrets, but probably contains household accounts. He lifts it, weighs it as if wisdom had mass, and sends it along to the copyists. Somewhere in the maze of rooms, a translator stretches. A mathematician smiles at a circle that behaves, and a poet considers whether the wind has a grammar. The city exhales. The library exhales with it. If you keep listening, the sound becomes narrower, like a page being turned very slowly by a considerate night, and then it becomes nothing at all, which is exactly the point. You might not expect a library to begin with a ruler counting clouds, but that is almost the mood in Alexandria when the idea takes its first unhurried breath. The new kings of Egypt like clear lists and long horizons. One of them is told that knowledge is a kind of harvest. It grows in many fields, ripens at odd hours, and spoils if you leave it under the wrong roof. He listens, folds the thought the way you fold a map before you know the route, and decides to build a home big enough for wandering minds. It will not be a temple exactly, though there will be altars to polite habits like lunch and lighting. It will not be a university exactly, though curiosity will enroll itself and forget to graduate. It will be an address where ideas are expected to remove their shoes at the door, where the noise is mostly pages talking to fingers. If you're still awake by the time we get to the inventory stickers, feel free to subscribe with the gentlest. Possible tap. The staff will register it as a breeze and file it under favorable weather. From the start, the city understands that the trick is not grandeur but paper cuts. A library grows by repetition. Clerks learn to tie bundles of papyrus so that the knots can be admired and undone with equal ease. Scribes practice a hand that looks like a calm whisper. A poet named Callimachus, who enjoys both footnotes and the shape of birds, begins to catalog with a devotion that future accountants will recognize as love. He groups authors the way a gardener groups herbs, by aroma and usefulness, and the chance that someone is going to ask for them in a hurry. The Mausean, the House of the Muses, which is also a stubbornly practical campus, plans its courtyards. So breezes carry dust away from ink. Someone keeps a jar for reeds measured to identical lengths. Another someone develops the habit of checking the level of lamp oil as if it were a moral question. Scholars are given stipends generous enough to purchase sandals that do not squeak, and meals simple enough to keep lunchtime debates focused on verbs rather than sauces. The city becomes a notebook that refuses to close dot to fill that notebook. Ships are persuaded to share the cargo that weighs almost nothing. Captains learn the new custom: declare your fakes, your wool, your epics. Anything written is escorted to a copying room where professional patience shines like a small, steady moon. Originals are kept in Alexandria, duplicates returned with thanks, and the whole transaction is wrapped in a courtesy that is both sincere and relentless. The policy earns a nickname books from the ships, and soon the harbor speaks in bibliographic weather. On some days the wind is mostly philosophical, with a chance of geometry. On others, romance at 12 knots, scattered medical tracks. Translators arrive from islands that produce vowels the way beehives produce humming. They bring dictionaries that are essentially long apologies to each other. In one corner, a mathematician measures shadows at noon and decides the planet is, trying to tell its size to anyone who bothers to listen. In another, a doctor argues that when the moon looks swollen, wounds behave as if they read the sky. A librarian sighs and adds a shelf labeled "Promising Theories, please handle kindly." The dream is not only to collect, but to standardize the chaos into something usable at bedtime. Author names are reconciled, no small peace treaty. Scrolls get tags that would look like barcodes if barcodes were carved by sunlight. There are quiet rules for how to quote someone you politely disagree with. There is even the beginning of interlibrary etiquette. A scholar who borrows a text sends back a commentary as if the book itself expected postcards. Alexandria becomes the kind of city where a child can ask whether God is spelled with one. A letter or two and be answered with a short lecture, a cookie, and a recommended comedy. Visiting dignitaries, unable to leave without a souvenir, accept copies of tragedies that come with small marks, indicating the correct places to be overwhelmed. The plan is not heroic. It is housework done well. It is the sort of plan that makes tomorrow tidy without needing to brag about it. News prefers flames to shelving systems. So when the fighting reaches the harbor and a general decides that fire negotiates faster than diplomacy, the story brightens to suit the gossip. Warehouses burn because they are good at it. Casks, ropes, and the furniture of sea trade contribute. Their enthusiasm. Later, everyone argues about whether those buildings counted as cousins of the library. The safest answer is that sparks behave like tourists, they wander. A few manuscripts are singed. A few are lost. Many are annoyed and brushed clean with peacock feathers. The city smells briefly like philosophy that has met a cooking fire. Once the ash settles, the copying rooms resume their steady chewing of silence. Librarians add a new checklist about storing papyrus away from anything that believes itself to be a torch. No one writes a tragic poem about the checklist, which is how you know it is effective. But time, not drama, becomes the slow architect of trouble. Roof tiles loosen with the quiet confidence of things that know gravity personally. A quartermaster changes the recipe for ink to save money and accidentally invents a shade called fadingly determined. Rats attend seminars on perseverance. The Nile arranges a flood on a day when the shutters were left politely open for a breeze. A dissertation on the growth of figs under various moons is misshelved among naval invoices and found years later, scented with salt and accurate anyway. Budgets arrive late wearing excuses. Budgets fail to arrive at all. The Mousian grows new wings and then forgets to oil their hinges, so knowledge begins to squeak as it moves. It does not decline so much. As the gradual substitution of repairs for dreams, the staff becomes adept at the noble art of making do. When people look for a single villain, they never lack for candidates. A generation talks about philosophers arguing too loudly in public. Another points to a bishop who had difficult neighbors in an even more difficult city. The most famous tale concerns a mathematician and teacher seized by a crowd that mistook conviction for permission. Her name becomes a lament that later centuries file under elegant symbol. Yet even here, the library appears less as a victim of one moment than as an institution already weary from many. When the Serapeum, the temple that had become the library's dignified satellite, falls to a mix of zeal and policy, some stacks vanish like a shoreline after years of considerate waves. Students scatter, syllabi curl into themselves. Copyists seek work in calmer precincts. Blame is assigned according to taste. Paper prefers causes that are plural dot, and then there is the story that arrives late and laughs softly at chronology. The baths heated by argument. A caliph, says the rumor, orders scrolls used as fuel, carefully balancing theology with thermodynamics. It is an excellent anecdote, clean, mischievous, and steamy. It appears long after the century that would have needed those fires. It contradicts the math of how quickly papyrus becomes both flame and regret. Historians, with their unhelpful fondness for sources, point out that the teller of the tale preferred memorable lines to plausible supply chains. Yet the image persists, citizens relaxing in scented rooms, while Aristotle helps maintain a comfortable temperature. The only kindness we can offer the myth is to admit its coziness. It turns loss into a service industry and therefore offends. Less, the librarians of Alexandria, who loved precision the way bakers love exact flour, would probably have smiled politely and asked for a receipt. If you are wondering what vanished quietly, the list is best imagined as a corridor you might stroll at a yawn. There are charts of winds with notes on the moods of harbors, useful to pilots and poets. There are manuals for machines that lift water with more dignity than buckets, drawn by hands that understood stubborn screws. There are plays that made. Audiences laugh about goats in ways still indecently current. There are commentaries in which a grammarian corrects a famous epic by humbly suggesting that a hero's boast contains a small error of number. There are glossaries of regional spice names that double as maps of human appetite. There are treatises on navigation that treat stars as colleagues. There are medical notebooks that argue gently about whether the pulse can be counted to music, a claim confirmed daily by drummers. None of these are world-ending losses. All of them are world-smoothing ones. Some inventions were not exactly inventions, but instructions on how to keep cleverness alive. How to make ink that resists gossip from sunlight. How to glue edges so that a codex does not behave like a rebellious fan. How to store maps without teaching them to curl. A small treatise on sandals explains why scribes should wear the kind that let the toes flex, because stiff footwear shortens attention. A table of measurements carefully aligns the weight of grain with the size of jars, a favor to bakers and scrutiny. Among the oddities is a manual for constructing automata that nod at the right moment during poetry readings. The ancestor of today's polite friend who knows when to say, There are also fragments of something like a librarian's dream. A formal theory of cataloging that tries to decide whether a book about rivers belongs to geography, poetry, or the human need to keep rivers company. The author gives up, wisely, and chooses alphabetical order, what the world could have been with 2 more centuries of this. Administrative romance is an unthreatening speculation. Perhaps the habit of translation becomes so smooth that arguments about calendars shrink to footnotes. Perhaps measurement standards stop quarreling earlier, allowing merchants to haggle over price rather than definition. A lens ground a little thinner might have found its way into a physician's hand sooner. A star observed a little more carefully might have rearranged a planet's seating chart without a scandal. Maybe the practical arts, the civil, comfortable, ones like drainage and air, would have earned the prestige usually reserved for thunder. Or perhaps nothing dramatic changes at all. Perhaps we merely inherit a deeper tradition of indexing, a world where the ordinary miracle is being able to find page 13 on purpose. The library's most radical promise was always simple. Tomorrow, you can continue exactly where you left off. There is a gentler what if that sleeps easily. Imagine a clerk, anonymous and fond of porridge, who invents a way to mark draft. Versions so that errors do not breed like polite rabbits across generations of copies. Imagine that notation becoming as common as sandals. Now pick any medieval argument you like and subtract 3 centuries of confusion caused by a smudge. The result is not fireworks, it is fewer headaches. In another register, imagine a map maker whose chart of monsoon timing is copied unbroken into every port log for 1,000 miles. The world would not be faster, it would be earlier to bed. Alexandria specialized in that sort of improvement. Its glory was always domestic. Better margins, steadier lamps, improved quiet dot. By now, the scenes in the reading rooms have slowed to a pace that would make a tortoise feel optimistic. A scholar walks with a scroll under his arm the way one carries bread, not urgently, but with purpose. A custodian rearranges stools so the shortest legs face the most forgiving floorboards. Birds meet on the roofline to discuss philosophy's contribution to seeds. Somewhere a translator admits that there are 3 respectable words for horizon, each correct from a different hill. A student, unsure whether she is reading history or prophecy, decides to copy the passage either way. The head librarian insists that authors' names be written out in full because initials encourage mischief. These are not the scenes of an institution poised for legend. They are the scenes of a household whose chores are knowledge and whose reward is an evening. Breezed out in the harbor, the routine continues because routine is how human promises eat breakfast. Another ship ties up. Another list of cargo is tucked behind the rope. The clerk lifts a bundle that looks like onions but crinkles like opinions, smiles at the captain in a language made of knots, and sends the package along a corridor that knows the way by heart. The copyists prepare ink that smells faintly of quiet. A philosopher reaches for a stylus with the same automatic grace with which a baker reaches for flour. Somewhere, a new catalog card is cut with a knife sharp enough to correct a mistake. In the air. And somewhere else, a young reader leans back, hearing inside her thoughts the small, satisfied click of a fact finding its shelf. This is how the legend was born, how it flickered, how it persists like a nightlight considerate enough to keep even our questions from stubbing their toes dotted as pleasant. Finally, to imagine the library as a gentle machine powered by curiosity and oil lamps. No alarms, no elevator music, only the dependable rhythm of pages that have learned how to breathe. What the city built was not a monument to be admired at noon, but a habit to be used after supper. And those centuries played their usual tricks, fires, floods, policies. The sudden popularity of being elsewhere, the habit did not vanish. It became a way of arranging thoughts that refuses to retire. Somewhere a modern reader opens a catalog and feels, without needing to say so, Alexandria's old invitation, "Come in, we are labeling the world." The door never closes. It merely sighs on its hinges. If you let the sound carry you, it fades into something softer than sleep and just as organized. And there, somewhere between a note on wind directions and a recipe for ink, is the silence the library always kept ready for anyone who needed it. You might not expect the quietest conspiracy in history to be about shelves, but there it is, beginning with a ruler who liked the way ideas sound when you line them up in a room and ask them to use their inside voices. The early kings of the Ptolemaic court wanted a city that could host the entire rumor of the world, and Alexandria, which was young and fond of geometry, fit the mood. So the plan was drawn with a gentle ruler and an even gentler schedule. Build a place where thinking could loiter without being asked to move along. A house for the muses, they called it, which is both lofty and domestic, like naming a palace. After your best teapot. The dream was not a single building, but a habit. If you're still awake by the time we sort the scrolls by size and season, you can subscribe with a drowsy tap. Consider it a small note in the margins that says yes, continue. First part of the story drifts in like morning light through shutters. Someone, perhaps Ptolemy, who enjoyed naming things after himself, is told that wisdom travels like grain, always arriving in sacks that need to be opened and sifted. He orders courtyards that hold breezes the way bowls hold water. Porticos are hung with shade thick enough to protect ink from shyness. Scholars are offered stipends and lunch, and in return they promise to be interesting at dinner. A librarian with the practical soul of a warehouse manager begins a catalog that eventually becomes the nervous system of the whole project. His name, Callimachus, flutters through the centuries alongside his pine eggs, which are not quite the first library catalog, but feel like the first time anyone looked at messy knowledge and decided to comb its hair. He lists authors by genre and hometown, and sometimes by the shape of their sentences, and if you've ever stood in a bookstore and sighed happily at a well-labeled shelf, you have shared his hobby. The city helps by being nosy in a polite, administrative way. Ships entering the harbor are asked about cargo with the same tone used for asking whether you've eaten, concern wrapped in custom, figs, linen, pepper, and yes, any books. Manuscripts are borrowed, copied with a perseverance that would make ants feel lazy and returned with thanks, unless the original is too pretty, in which case the copy goes back and the original stays, which is an early example of a library getting the better end of a trade through charm and a receipt. Translators move in like weather. They argue about the correct word for horizon in a language that has 2 perfect choices and 3 good excuses. Teachers adopt polite feuds with dictionaries. In a corner, a mathematician counts shadows at noon and discovers the size of a planet, using nothing but a stick, some geometry, and an agreeable sun. In another, a physician inquires whether the pulse keeps time like a drummer, and whether patients are just metronomes with opinions. The Mausian becomes less of a building and more of a posture. We imagine the scrolls as soft-bodied fish in a tidy stream, flowing from scriptorium to reader and back again, their skin of papyrus catching a current of fingertips. Storage turns out to be philosophy with carpentry. Shelves prefer the shade. Glue prefers honesty. Lamps prefer to be fed. A set of clerks with the patience of lichens keep styluses sharp, seals ready, and labels legible. The clever among them invent a way to mark doubtful lines with tiny dots, the ancestor of those sticky notes that say, check this later, and somehow never leave. There's gossip about which scrolls have the most borrowed creases, and a small scandal when a historian is caught reading comedy during the hours assigned to weightier matters. The head librarian declares a new rule. You may study the structure of laughter if you carefully record your findings. Bureaucracy, handled tenderly, becomes permission. Ships bring not only cargo but questions. A captain from Rhodes declares he has a manuscript of Sappho and 3 opinions about winds. A trader insists that an engineer on his crew has designed a screw that lifts water cheerfully uphill, which sounds like boasting until the thing is demonstrated beside the garden and the cucumbers look impressed. Letters arrive from other cities, some of them from people we now greet like old friends, Aristarchus worrying about the sun's proper place, Hipparchus staring up at night until it blinks first, Euclid explaining patiently that the shortest path between 2 points is also the most restful. Copies of copies spread like polite rumors. A scholar diets not to slim down, but to qualify for the stipend category labeled light luncheon. A poet writes a hymn to ink that stains beautifully. The librarians, who like facts the way bakers like flour, add another shelf to the catalog. And carry on dot, and then, because news needs drama, the way papyrus needs shade, there is the story with flames. The city quarrels with itself and with guests who never learned indoor voices. Soldiers set protective fires in the harbor, and fire, being excellent at follow-through, protects more than intended. Warehouses produce their own weather. The air smells briefly of rope, oil, and opinions. A century later, people argue about whether the fire licked the library's shelves or merely toasted its cousins on the docks. The safest answer is that sparks are social and books are curious, and some courtship occurred. But the copying rooms reopen after the embers cool. The catalog survives with a singed corner that looks like a wink, and the work of routine begins. Again, which is the truest resurrection most institutions ever manage. Decline when it arrives is less a fall than a series of naps. Roof tiles loosen like old friendships. The budget, which once walked in on time and proud, starts sending letters about unforeseen circumstances. Ink recipes change to accommodate thrift and invent the unfortunate color called almost. Scribes learn to stretch a sheet of papyrus the way a cook stretches stew. A flood takes a shortcut through a hallway and leaves a watermark shaped like a reluctant map. The policy of ship borrowing has to be explained more beautifully each year to keep working. Students discover distractions with the efficiency of ants discovering sugar. None of it is sensational. All of it is cumulative. Someone starts a folder labeled repairs we have named, which becomes amusing only to those who have stayed long. Enough to admire Staples' dot blame, like a good cloak, fits many shoulders. Later centuries find villains they recognize, generals with flints, priests with policies, a bishop who needed fewer arguments or sturdier neighbors, a mob that mistook passion for permission. The murder of a mathematician and teacher so often, told with the neatness of a morality play, becomes a symbol big enough to hold every kind of regret. Yet inside all that telling is a quieter arithmetic. The library depended on yearly choices as tiny as dusting and as grand as hiring. And when enough of those choices suffered, the system lost its rhythm. The Great Serapeum, a temple that became the library's composed cousin, endured renovations that looked suspiciously like erasures, and then survived a public disagreement by not surviving at all. If you crave a single culprit, the catalog will file your request under many factors. Cross-reference with human nature, large print. Myths arrive last because they like to see what seats are taken. The warmest of them tells of a caliph who, many centuries too late, heated the baths with unfortunate literature and logical bravado. Historians raise their brows like careful awnings and point to calendars that disagree. Papyrus, they note, burns quickly enough to make cues awkward, and Alexandria had fuel less argumentative than Aristotle. Still, the picture is comfortable. Citizens steaming themselves in borrowed philosophy, the city perfumed by paradox. People keep telling it because it changes grief into utility, which is a form of mercy. Librarians who trust invoices over anecdotes would ask to see the woodpile. What the world lost, if we allow our imagination to shuffle gently through the stacks, was not a single masterpiece wrapped in velvet, but 1,000 small tools that made tomorrow behave. Tables of winds with notes about how sailors say thank you to weather. Guides to reed cutting that prevent squeaky pens and therefore prevent arguments. Stage directions for comedies we can only reconstruct from footnotes that laugh alone. Manuals for automata that bow at the correct moment during poetry readings, saving the host from awkwardness. Cookbooks that explain how to travel with spices. Like a diplomat, so nothing quarrels with the pot. Star charts written with the confidence of people who feel friendly toward the night. Medical notes about pulse songs, maps that admit rivers move. None of these guarantee a faster world. Together, they promise a calmer one. Even the mechanical things feel homely rather than heroic. There are water-lifting screws and simple cranes that spare the backs of workers who have already done enough. There are instructions for keeping lens polish from becoming jealous of humidity. There are lists of standard measures with margins full of field corrections, the outward sign of commerce learning its please and thank you. A proposed calendar tries to persuade the moon to respect appointments. A shaky little treatise asks whether a codex, a book with pages, almost indecently modern, might save us from the tripping hazard of long scrolls. A poet complains that page turns interrupt metaphors. A reader replies that life interrupts everything, and we go on. The librarians file the argument under form and function and recommend tea. The gentlest what if does not demand an alternate renaissance, but settles politely for maintenance arriving early. Suppose the habit of cross-referencing grew wider. Roots. Suppose marginal notes traveled safely instead of mutating into legends. Suppose standardized symbols for I am not sure and this is a guess became as common as commas. The result would not be fireworks. It would be fewer collisions at the intersections of knowledge. A mapmaker in India and a captain in the Red Sea would coordinate monsoon gossip into arrival times. A physician in Pergamon would read a report from Alexandria and skip an error about dosage, leaving a patient quietly alive. A court would argue about taxes using the same units on both sides. A miracle so dull and so precious that it could rock a nation to sleep. When we imagine the library merely as shelves, we miss its real invention, which was tempo. Everything there moved at the pace of legible ink. The city offered its scholars the gift of hours that didn't need excuses. A day could be spent deciding whether a word in Homer meant spark or smile, and the answer could wait until morning without collapse. It's an almost boring heroism, the courage to linger. In that sense, the library survives wherever a dusk lamp learns the patient trick of never rushing its pool of light. We inherit this more than we inherit any single text. If you have ever paused in front of a paragraph and felt the page watching you kindly, as if it understood your hesitation, you have met the institution that Alexandria invented. Tonight, that reading rooms restored in imagination are emptying slowly. A student rolls a scroll the way you might settle a blanket onto a sleeping cat, carefully and with the sense that this particular posture will have to be repeated. A custodian checks window latches with the solemnity of a priest of breezes. Two scholars stand in the doorway arguing about nothing urgent, the shapes of letters in different hands, which is almost gossip about vowels. In the courtyard, a mathematician listens to water climb a screw and decides that the sound is almost a proof. Somewhere a small tray holds reed pens, soaking like quiet reeds in a mild lake. A librarian signs out the last key and writes the time. In Immersion, the most delicate of ceremonies. And back at the harbor, the ships keep arriving in the way sleep arrives, confidently, without consulting us. A clerk with neat nods asks about cargo and then about books with the exact same politeness. The city's promise continues to keep itself. Knowledge will be held, not gripped. Scrolls travel down hallways already polished by other scrolls. Copyists prepare ink that smells faintly of patience. Each new arrival earns a tiny card, which is merely paper until someone writes on it a path that another person will someday follow. Perhaps yawning, perhaps interested, but always welcomed. The habit survives the building. The door is always almost closing and never quite does. And the last sound at night is the soft click of a thought finding a shelf. The truest music of a library that intended nothing more than to be ready for. Your next sentence and ended up soothing centuries with the same simple promise. Again and again, until, without noticing, you rest inside it. You might not expect the quietest conspiracy to be about shelves, but this one is. It starts not with a cloak, a dagger, or a whispered password, but with rooms designed for the gentle friction of papyrus against wood. A king with a tidy mind wanted a city where the world could be filed. He had seen markets for spices, markets for fish, even markets for opinions. Why not a market for memory, arranged by author and carefully dusted? You can picture the plan sketched in the air with a ringed finger, a house for the muses, breezy galleries, calm courtyards, staff who understood that a book is just a very patient conversation. If you're still awake by the time I explain how they borrowed every manuscript that touched the harbor, feel free to subscribe in your sleep. I promise not to make a big deal of it. The dream worked best when it moved slowly. Scholars were offered stipends, meals, and the kind of quiet that makes a thought unfold like a napkin. They lived as if curiosity were a civil service job with excellent tea. A librarian named Callimachus, who secretly loved order the way bakers love flour dust, and sunlight made the pine aches, a catalog of catalogs, a list of lists, an index that sounded like a polite cough from across the centuries. He grouped poetry with poetry, drama with drama, and the awkward in a section called miscellany, which is just a kind way of saying everything we're not ready to argue about. The catalog kept growing like a vine that had learned calligraphy. If a scroll changed hands, the catalog updated its address with the sobriety of an undertaker and the pride of a postman. Somewhere in the stacks, a clerk devised a tiny dot to mark doubtful lines, the ancestor of every sticky note that says, "Check this later," and quietly becomes permanent. The harbor was a mouth that couldn't stop tasting. Ships arrived carrying cinnamon and mathematics, olive oil and theories with loose screws. Dock officials asked about cargo and, in exactly the same tone, about books. Customs had a soft clause known informally as just for copying. Manuscripts were borrowed, copied by scribes who measured patience with a knife that split reed pens and returned with thanks. Sometimes the originals stayed, the copy sailed away, and the paperwork looked very pleased with itself. Translators argued about whether horizon in one language lined up with a limit in another. The Septuagint grew out of those. Arguments like a chessboard grows out of a table, slowly and then obviously. Meanwhile, Euclid explained triangles to anyone who would sit still long enough. Eratosthenes accused the earth of being round, and then proved it with a stick and a shadow. And Aristarchus suggested that the sun would prefer the center if no. One-minded. It was a city where a person could overhear astronomy while buying figs. You might imagine the rooms as solemn, but they were domestically serious, like kitchens where bread always rises. Lamps were trimmed low so that heat, which is a rival of glue, would not get ideas. Shelves were rubbed with a whisper of oil as if they had elbows. The copyists kept a little dish of pumice to erase the impatience of their earlier selves. There were debates about how tall a scroll should be before it became a tripping hazard. Someone proposed the codex, a book with pages you could turn without rolling anything across the floor, and a poet objected that page turns interrupt metaphors. A librarian wrote both positions on a card and filed it under form versus function, where it remains eternally undecided and content. From the ends of the earth came more than words. Engineers delivered small prototypes like friendly insects. A screw that lifted water uphill turned in a garden beside herbs that pretended not to steer. Simple cranes offered help to backs that had already done enough. A pneumatic trick astonished guests by opening a temple door when a fire was lit on the altar, which is to say the gods accepted sacrifices and mild hydraulics. Not everything worked. A mechanical bird refused to sing on Thursdays, and a clock that told star time developed opinions about clouds. The librarians dutifully recorded successes, failures, and maintenance schedules. When you treat knowledge like a public bath open, scheduled, a little steamy people come back cleaner and more relaxed than before. The city learned to live with this new rhythm, but flames travel faster than quiet. During a war that included Julius Caesar, ships burned in the harbor because fire is a persuasive bodyguard and sometimes forgets whom it's protecting. Sparks behaved as sparks do, with ambition. Warehouses near the docks roasted their inventories until even the spices had to admit they were overwhelmed. Later, people would argue about whether the library's heart was singed or whether only its neighbors were toasted. The safest answer is a shrug shaped like a question mark. Fires are social, scrolls are curious, introductions were made. Yet the catalog did not vanish that day. The copying rooms reopened, smelling briefly of inconvenience and then of ink again. The librarians, who had already trained themselves to rescue meaning from smudges, did what good institutions do after any accident. They counted, they repaired, they made tea. Decline arrived without costume or speech, the way dusk simply shows up. Budgets developed soft spots. Roof tiles considered early retirement. A flood wrote its initials on a wall and wandered away. Scribes grew economical with ink and produced. The color called almost. When rulers changed, they sometimes preferred trumpets to footnotes. The staff who once argued about commas learned to argue about salaries with equal rigor and less joy. Students discovered the indoor sport of not finishing things. The library was not ruined by one villain, but by a long conversation with gravity, moisture, and human nature. In margins, you can still read the small size. Repaired again. Please stop leaning ladders here. Return to shelf 27 or the nearest reasonable substitute. Blame, when it finally drifted in, arrived neatly labeled. Some said pagans, wrecked it. Others said Christians. Others said sensible people trying to keep their heads while policies and passions shook the room. A philosopher named Hypatia was killed in a way that refuses to sit quietly in history. The fact that she had taught mathematics only adds to the discomfort because numbers usually behave. The Serapeum, a grand temple that housed books like a dignified uncle, was demolished during a different quarrel, and later writers penned more laws there. Still later, a pleasant story was told about a caliph heating the baths with philosophy. The tale explains itself with tidy logic. If a book agrees with Holy Writ, it is redundant, and if it disagrees, it is dangerous. Therefore, into the furnace either way. Look how warm the water is. The problem is that papyrus burns fast, baths prefer steady fuel, and everyone at the time would have used wood because it is boring, dependable, and available. The legend persists because it is narratively ergonomic. You can carry it without straying. The quieter culprits were simpler, termites with good appetites, damp with a patient plan, scribes who moved away and took their skills with them like portable weather. The catalog could survive a fire, but not a century of slow later. Each new generation assumed the previous one had renewed the receipts. A city can lose a library the way a family loses a recipe, not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of meals where something is almost remembered and then replaced by close enough. If you walk through the imagined rooms now, you can still hear what the world lost humming at a conversational volume. It is not one miracle text wrapped in ribbon. It is the 1,000 small tools of tomorrow, tables of wings noting the polite habits of monsoons, a mapmaker's argument for drawing coastlines as if they were slightly embarrassed, reports from doctors on the music of pulse and what emotions do to tempo, handbooks for instrument makers explaining how to persuade reeds to be less squeaky, star lists that wink kindly and admit that stars wander, a cookbook that treats Pepper like a diplomatic guest who must be seated carefully, an essay titled On Glue with Opinions, a shipping manual that proposes standardized containers for amphorae and in doing so invents organization with clay. None of this explodes, all of it accumulates. Put together, it is the difference between a city that stumbles and a city that ambles without tripping. There were also toys, because curiosity likes weekends. Little carts moved when heated air took a scenic route through pipes. A coin-operated holy water dispenser taught crowds the principle of the vending machine and the theology of exact change. Stage machinery created thunder not to frighten, but to delight, teaching audiences that the gods have technicians. A fountain sent water upstream the way a joke sends laughter back to the teller. A mathematician, sitting near that fountain, realized that a screw turning gently is a prayer for gardens. The greatest invention of the library was not a device but a schedule. It institutionalized the luxury of attention. An astronomer could spend an afternoon deciding whether a star was a star or merely an opinion about a star. A grammarian could trace a preposition until both of them took a nap. A geographer could draw a new line on a map and then get up to stretch, confident that the line would still be there after tea. This slow courage is what we miss most when we mourn the building. The world doesn't often fund patience. The library did, and patience repaid the grant. It is tempting to ask what might have been, to imagine an earlier Renaissance with prettier bookstands. But the softer, more reasonable what if is administrative. What if the habit of cross-referencing had spread like a good rumor? What if every copyist marked guesses as guesses and every mapmaker dated the river they drew? What if footnotes were treated like bridges instead of fences? Then a sailor in the Red Sea reading a note from a scholar in India would adjust sails 3 days sooner. A physician in Pergamon would skip a dosage error and keep a patient comfortably alive. A judge comparing tax records would find that both sides used the same weight for the word pound, which is a miracle so dull it could rescue a nation from headaches. Even in decline, the library taught the lesson of housekeeping, bindings, prefer shade, moths admire glue. Doors like to be opened and closed at regular times, so they do not learn bad habits. Pens, if soaked lovingly, will write longer. If sharpened anxiously, they sulk. Lamps must be fed, but not indulged. These are rules that apply equally to institutions and to people trying to sleep. The library's etiquette survives in sensible offices everywhere. Label things kindly. Return them slightly better than you found them. Keep tea hot enough for second thoughts. Distrust rumors with perfect edges. Tonight, if you want, You can listen for the city's old rhythm. The lighthouse blinks its enormous eyelid. Somewhere a clerk puts a tiny dot beside a doubtful line and finds comfort in the dot itself. Somewhere a teacher repeats a lesson about triangles as if it were a lullaby. Somewhere a dusty breeze negotiates. With a window and winds quietly, a student nods off over a scroll and leaves a crease that centuries later will be mistaken for emphasis. The catalog will dutifully record it as where. The harbor continues its habit of asking ships about their manuscripts. A captain volunteers a small lyric, a first draft of a letter, someone's shopping list that reads like a poem about onions. The librarians copy it because collecting is a long way of saying yes, Dot, in this imagined last watch. The building does not vanish, it simply exhales. A custodian carries the final lamp, the way one carries a sleeping child. The key turns with that satisfied click known to all libraries, locked or lost. The catalog, which has practiced immortality longer than most of us, lies still and does not mind. The wind from the sea moves past the colonnades as if it knew the route by heart. Knowledge, which never needed walls, keeps walking. It stops. At other tables, in other centuries, in rooms where pencils have replaced reeds and screens glow with a soft aquarium light. The same old arguments wait horizon or limit, spark or smile, but now they are joined by new ones, all of them equally drowsy, equally dear. If you arrive late and press your ear to the door of the past, you will hear neither shouting nor silence, but the small domestic sounds of a library settling for sleep, a shelf adjusting itself, a rolled scroll relaxing one twist, a pen deciding it has written enough for one lifetime. The conspiracy, it turns out, was velvet because it was only ever about comfort, the comfort of order, of return, of names that know where they live. You can trust this, you can rest in it, and if, as you drift, you feel the faintest urge to leave a bookmark here so you can come back in the morning, the librarians will be delighted. They specialize in mornings that are still thinking about yesterday, and they will keep your place with a card small as a promise and just as patient until the light is ready again.